So for a while, I had very cheekily, somewhat provocatively, as my bio on Twitter, just literally Satan, which is maybe an interesting bio for a priest to have. And it was really my reference to the fact that extremely often online, it seems to be the favorite attack of the faceless internet trolls is to, in fact, call me literally Satan, minister of the devil. That's also a super fun one. Usually when I am doing things like advocating for the affirmation and inclusion of LGBTQ identities within the umbrella of the church, when I have the audacity to exist as a female pastor, when I do things like talking about not believing in hell, which we're going to talk more about next week, so stay tuned for that one. But oh boy, does that get people angry. And when I sit with this, right, like why do nameless trolls on the internet feel compelled to call a random person on the internet, in fact, the literal devil? I think what they are getting at, and this is me giving them some extreme benefit of the doubt, I think what they are getting at is not that I have little horns and a tail, not some image of a literal, little devil running around, but in fact, that idea of Satan as the adversary. Something of what they hear me talking about is fundamentally adverse to their understanding of what the mission and the purpose and the message of Christianity is. And I think it's helpful for us to sit with that, right? That idea of what it means to name Satan when we come to this week's gospel passage, which is a doozy, right? It's kind of weird. It's strange to hear Jesus using the same words to refer to one of his disciples in the same way that faceless internet trolls talk to me. Right? That's not what we are used to seeing from Jesus. Especially not when Peter, bless him, has gone from being the cornerstone and the rock of the church to, last week, to a stumbling block this week. But I think what Jesus is getting at and what's going on in this passage is something about Peter's behavior and Peter's words being indeed that of what is in fact adverse, what is the adversary to the point of Jesus' message and ministry. And in sitting with this harsh language from Jesus, we can actually see what is truly the antithesis of the gospel as Jesus names it, not as faceless internet trolls want to name it. Which is that what is contrary to the gospel is that attempt to cling to a sense of life. Not, in fact, what the point of the gospel is, which is the way of true life, life abundant, that comes ironically and paradoxically through death, as demonstrated in the cross and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So what we have going on here is yet another part of this sort of three-part crux, pun intended, I guess, of the gospel that I talked about last week, right? In the gospels, there are these three moments that are always linked together. We have Peter's confession of Jesus as the Messiah, which we heard last week. We have the moment of the transfiguration when Jesus takes his three closest friends up and is revealed in the fullness of his divinity. And then at this moment when the nature of Jesus' divinity is revealed, we have Jesus beginning then to make the predictions of his coming suffering and death. So this is the first time those disciples are hearing Jesus say that he's going to suffer and die as part of what it means for him to be the Messiah. The core of what it means for him to be the Messiah. And Peter's response here is so incredibly human. God forbid it, Lord, this must not be. And I think what Peter is articulating is something very real and honest and indeed human, right? I don't think it's, very often Peter gets blasted for wanting, a dominant military messiah, someone who's going to come take down the Roman Empire. And, what he wants from the Messiah is worldly might and power. And I think what's going on here is something much more relatable, right? Who wants to hear that their teacher, their friend, someone that they have lived and walked with and learned from for years at this point, is saying he's about to undergo something incredibly gruesome and horrible and painful? God forbid it, Lord, this must not be. It's right and understandable for Peter to want his friend to live, to thrive, to not undergo hardship. And yet this is what Jesus says is satanic, is of the adversary, is so fundamentally contrary to the purpose of the good news that Jesus has come to proclaim, that Jesus does in fact call Peter a stumbling block, and indeed, literally, Satan. And it is a reminder to us that at the core of the gospel is that call, indeed, to take up our crosses, to lay down what we understand as good, comfortable, easy life for the sake of falling in the way of Christ. And I think it's important for us to remember that this message has often been used and abused by the churches to tell often the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, to bear their cross for the sake of some sense of Christian martyrdom. Indeed, all those people that call me literally Satan on the internet might appreciate knowing that as a teenager in high school, I actually played Satan for a summer on evangelical mission trips in Eastern Europe, where I got to play Satan because a woman couldn't play Jesus or God, but a woman could definitely play Satan. We can unpack that later. On those mission trips, I was introduced to a demand of obedience, a demand for suffering, ostensibly following in the cross of Christ, that today we would quite rightly label as spiritually abusive. So I think it is fair for us to sit with how the message of the cross and the call to lay down our lives for the sake of the gospel has certainly been misused by the church. And yet, I do think there is something very, very critical for us to sit with in today's gospel, particularly when we look at that much more human side of Peter, whose rebuke to Jesus is not out of some quest for incredible power, but is just something very understandable and relatable, wanting safety and security for his friend. And I wonder how much of the lure of Satan if we want to use that harsh language, is for us often similarly insidious, right? The call and the temptation to comfort, security, stability, holding to what is known rather than entering into the discomfort of what it means to radically follow in the way of Christ. I've been thinking about that quite a lot lately when we consider this stage of late pandemic, whatever it is that we are in now. But I think about how 3.5 years ago, our world experienced an incredibly catastrophic, earth-shattering event. And those early weeks of the pandemic were such a time of anxiety, tragedy, suffering, but also, I think, apocalypse in the sense of eye-opening, right? Imagining how we suddenly were aware of how much our society relied on those essential workers bagging up our groceries. How much we suddenly, maybe for like a week there, actually took incredibly seriously our communal call to care for one another. I remember sitting in a clergy event with Michael Curry, the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, saying that he hoped that coming out of the pandemic, we would not just succumb once again to a new normal, but that we might embrace a new creation and a new way of being in relationship with one another. For a moment there, we were poised to have a real reckoning of racial justice in our country. And yet, I wonder how insidiously we have allowed ourselves to just slip back into the way of normal because it is comfortable. It's what's known. We've all been through a massive collective trauma, and so we cling back to what the world that we knew used to look like. And it doesn't feel like we have lived into that promise that Bishop Curry articulated of embracing a new creation. And even as I find myself rejoicing in the ways that we are able to reclaim community, I find myself weary and exhausted by all of the same busyness creeping in, and overwhelmed by holding myself and the church up to the same metrics of success that were defined in a world that is now pretty much gone, right? And I wonder what a world where we let go of the life that we knew for the life that could be might look like for us personally, for the church, for the world. So that's kind of a somber note. So I will end on what I actually think is a great example of promise and hope in our just immediate community here at Harcourt Parish, which is the parish house. So since I have been here, and indeed since I was interviewing for this position, the parish house was talked about as this like lodestone on the parish, on our resources, on our mission. No one knew quite what to do with it. We had very serious arguments about selling it. And often we were trying to hold it so tight and close because we were using it as like a rental property, and so had to be kept in a pristine, immaculate condition, that our students themselves often felt like trespassers in the place that was meant to be the core of our ministry. And then as it sat unused during those early years of COVID, We had the opportunity as Adversary to reimagine it, to actually take a risk and a leap of faith and put tremendous resources into rehabilitating it, rethinking how we might use it, and to let go of it just for ourselves and to see it as a source of ministry for the community. And now it is a place that feels thriving with life. Whether Jeremy and Ellie are in there watching Grey's Anatomy, which is awesome, or students are coming in for bagels on Thursday morning, to be able to open it up to our Muslim community as a place of prayer, and now a Buddhist community having meditations in there weekly. As we have let go of that property just for ourselves, it has become a place thriving with life and a source of real life and community for us and for the people outside of the immediate bounds of our parish. And that is glorious. And I want to commend the faithfulness of the parish for seeing that opportunity. And I wonder what else we might do and be if we surrender to the idea of life that we hold on to for the way of life that is known through death and resurrection that the gospel of Christ calls us to.